Hi, everybody. Great to be with you. My name is Michael Millerman, millermanschool.com. I have a new free 30-day introduction to philosophy. The link is in the description below. Today, we're going to have a long stream where we read over an article by Leo Strauss called Progress or Return, the Contemporary Crisis in Western Civilization. So sometimes, as you know, on this channel, we read shorter articles, kind of things that are published in journals and magazines and so on. But here we have a nice, long, serious, thoughtful, topical essay by Leo Strauss, a figure so important to this channel. And let's just dive right into it. I will throw the chat on from time to time, and we'll have it up on screen like that when it's appropriate. But for now, let's begin with Strauss's essay. The title of this lecture indicates that progress has become a problem, that it could seem as if progress has led us to the brink of an abyss, and it is therefore necessary to consider alternatives to it. For example, to stop where we are, or else, if this should be impossible, to return. Return is the translation for the Hebrew word teshuvah. Teshuvah has an ordinary and an emphatic meaning. Its emphatic meaning is rendered in English by repentance. Repentance is return, meaning the return from the wrong way to the right one. This implies that we were once on the right way before we turned to the wrong way. Originally, we were on the right way. Deviation or sin or imperfection is not original. Man is originally at home in his father's house. He becomes a stranger through estrangement, through sinful estrangement. Repentance, return is homecoming. Let me just say something. I think it would take us forever if I stopped to comment on everything along the way as we go through this essay. But to give you an example of how you learn to read Strauss and how you learn to pay attention to the details of his exposition, look what he says here. He says that return implies that you went astray. You're returning to the right path. Originally, we were on the right way. So there are writings of Strauss's where he distinguishes this question concerning the politics of origins, as it were, which is this: is man's beginning fundamentally perfect or imperfect? Because if it's perfect, then in some sense we are responsible for our going astray. But if our beginnings are imperfect, if originally our nature is undeveloped or underdeveloped or something like that, then the error at the beginning of our history is not one for which we can be blamed. Kind of argument that Strauss pays attention to in several of his writings. So here you just see it in passing. A return or repentance implies that we were once on the right way before we turned to the wrong one, and therefore that sin or imperfection is not original. I remind you, he continues, of a few verses from the first chapter of Isaiah. How is the faithful city become a harlot? It was full of judgment, righteousness lodged in it, but now murderers. Therefore saith the Lord, I will restore thy judges as at first, and thy counselors as at the beginning. Afterwards thou shalt be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city. Unquote. Repentance is return. Redemption is restoration. A perfect beginning, the faithful city, is followed by defection, decline, sin, and this is followed by a perfect end. But the perfect end is the restoration of the perfect beginning. The faithful city at the beginning and at the end. At the beginning, Strauss continues, men did not roam a forest left to themselves unprotected and unguided, as for instance, maybe they do in some modern state of nature theories. The beginning is the Garden of Eden. Perfection results in the beginning of time, the oldest time. Hence, perfection is sought derivatively in the old time, in the father of fathers, the patriarchs. Okay, the older is better. What came later was worse. Therefore, the task is to return, and to return to the best scenario, the father of fathers, the patriarchs. The patriarchs are the divine chariot, which Ezekiel had seen in his vision. The great time, the classic time, is in the past. First, the period of the desert, later, the period of the temple. The life of the Jew is the life of recollection. Remember, here he's talking about return, using the example of the Jewish teshuvah, redemption. But if you're not Jewish and don't want to use those categories, you can consider what return might look like in other traditions that you're familiar with. The life of the Jew is the life of recollection. It is at the same time a life of anticipation, of hope. But the hope for redemption is restoration. Restituto in integro, Jeremiah 30. Their children shall be as aforetime. Okay? Your hope for the future is that things will be like they were before. Redemption consists in the return of the youngest, the most remote from the past, the most future ones, so to speak, to the pristine condition. The past is superior to the present. This thought is then perfectly compatible with hope for the future. But does the hope for redemption, the expectation of the Messiah, not assign a much higher place to the future than to the past, however venerable? No, Strauss here says, this is not unqualifiedly true. So hope in a messianic era, hope for a Messiah, doesn't mean that you value or that you think that the future will be better than the past. Let's see why. According to the most accepted view, meaning of the Jewish tradition, the Messiah is inferior to Moses. The Messianic age will witness the restoration of the full practice of the Torah, Jewish law, Jewish Bible, a part of which was discontinued owing to the destruction of the temple. Belief in the Torah was always the way in Judaism, whereas Messianism frequently became dormant. For example, Strauss writes, as I learned from Gershom Scholem, if you guys don't know, Gershom Scholem, a renowned scholar of the history of Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and so on. So Strauss writes, as I learned from Gershom Scholem, Kabbalism prior to the 16th century concentrated upon the beginning. It was only with Isaac Luria that Kabbalism began to concentrate upon the future, upon the end. Yet even here, the last age became as important as the first. It did not become more important. Furthermore, Strauss says, quoting Scholem, by inclination and habit, Luria was decidedly conservative. This tendency is well expressed in persistent attempts to relate what he had to say to older authorities. For Luria, salvation means actually nothing but restitution, reintegration of the original whole, or tikkun, to use the Hebrew term. For Luria, the appearance of the Messiah is nothing but the consummation of the continuous process of restoration. The path to the end of all things is also the path to the beginning, unquote. That was Strauss quoting Gershom Scholem. Judaism is a concern with return. It is not a concern with progress. Return can, by the way, as many of you no doubt know, many modern contemporary progressives have been Jewish, and there's a kind of Jewish progressivism. But here Strauss is indicating that it doesn't belong to the nature of Judaism, which in fact is not focused on progress, but on return, repentance, and a going back. As he writes again, Judaism is a concern with return. It is not a concern with progress. Return can easily be expressed in biblical Hebrew. Progress cannot. Hebrew renderings of progress seem to be somehow artificial, not to say paradoxical. Even if it were true that messianism bespeaks the predominance of the concern with the future, or of living toward the future, this would not affect in any way the belief in the superiority of the past to the present. The fact that the present is nearer in time to the final redemption than is the past does not mean, of course, that the present is superior in piety or wisdom to the past, especially to the classic past. Today, the word teshuvah, repentance, has acquired a still more emphatic meaning. Today, teshuvah sometimes means not a return which takes place within Judaism, but a return to Judaism on the part of many Jews who or whose fathers had broken with Judaism as a whole. That abandonment of Judaism, that break with Judaism, did not understand itself, of course, as a defection or a desertion, as leaving the right way, nor did it understand itself as a return to a truth which the Jewish tradition in its turn had deserted, nor even merely a turn to something superior. I'll comment on this in a minute. It understood itself as progress. It granted to the Jewish tradition, as it were, that Judaism is old, very old, whereas it itself had no past of which it could boast. Like traditional Judaism is old, modern progressivism is new, so let's say that's granted. But it regarded this very fact, the antiquity of Judaism, as a proof of its own superiority and of Judaism's inadequacy. 4, it questioned the very premise underlying the notion of return. And listen up here, because even if you've been lost in the Judaism and Jewish thought and Teshuvah and Gershom Scholem and Kabbalah, well, the underlying principle is more broadly applicable and more broadly relevant. So progressivism questioned the very premise underlying the notion of return, that premise being the perfect character of the beginning and of the olden times. So again, that history is decline or decay or fall or collapse. It assumed that the beginning, that is, progressivism assumed that the beginning is most imperfect, and that perfection can be found only in the end. So much so that the movement from the beginning toward the end is in principle a progress from radical imperfection toward perfection. From this point of view, age did not have any claim whatsoever to veneration. Antiquity rather deserved contempt, or possibly contempt mitigated by pity. So you can ask yourselves, what is implied by the idea that we should revere our ancestors, or that we should revere the customary teaching, or that there is a golden age behind us? Progressivism flips that on its head, as you know, and as you can see in Strauss's presentation of it. Let us try to clarify this issue somewhat more fully by contrasting the life characterized by the idea of return with the life characterized by the idea of progress. Thanks for being here, by the way. We're reading Leo Strauss's Progress or Return. When the prophets call their people to account, they do not limit themselves to accusing them of this or that particular crime or sin. They recognize the root of all particular crimes in the fact that the people have forsaken their God. They accuse their people of rebellion. Originally in the past, they were faithful or loyal. Now they are in a state of rebellion. In the future, they will return, and God will restore them to their original place. The primary, original, initial is loyalty. Unfaithfulness, infidelity, is secondary. The very notion of unfaithfulness or infidelity presupposes that fidelity or loyalty is primary. The perfect character of the origin is a condition of sin, of the thought of sin. Man who understands himself in this way longs for the perfection of the origin or of the classic past. He suffers from the present. He hopes for the future. Many of you who follow the conservative revolutionary thinkers, the traditionalist right, right-wing anti-liberalism, all of those kinds of movements, you know this idea. Return, return, return. Progressive man, on the other hand, looks back to a most imperfect beginning. The beginning is barbarism, stupidity, rudeness, extreme scarcity. Okay, very far from perfection, paradise, Garden of Eden. He does not feel that he has lost something of great, not to say infinite importance. He has lost only his chains. He does not suffer from the recollection of the past. Looking back to the past, he's proud of his achievements. He's certain of the superiority of the present to the past. He is not satisfied with the present. He looks to future progress. But he does not merely hope or pray for a better future. He thinks that he can bring it about by his own effort. Seeking perfection in a future, which is in no sense the beginning or the restoration of the beginning, he lives unqualifiedly toward the future. The life which understands itself as a life of loyalty or faithfulness appears to him as backward, as being under the spell of old prejudices. You're all familiar with that. Reactionary, outdated, old-fashioned, all meant as slurs. What the others call rebellion, he calls revolution or liberation. To the polarity faithfulness rebellion, he opposes the polarity prejudice freedom. To repeat, Strauss continues, the return to Judaism succeeds a break with Judaism, which eventually or from the beginning understood itself as a progress beyond Judaism. That break was effected in a classic manner by a solitary man, Spinoza. And just before I continue this, you should know that Leo Strauss wrote a book on Spinoza, that he's thought very deeply about Spinoza. And if you have any interest in all of that, there's much that you could pursue and that you could read about Strauss on Spinoza. But here we continue with this exposition. Spinoza denied the truth of Judaism. Judaism, which includes, of course, the Bible, is, for him, a set of prejudices and superstitious practices of the ancient tribes. Spinoza found in this mass of heterogeneous lore some elements of truth, but he did not consider this as peculiar to Judaism. He found the same elements of truth in paganism as well. Spinoza was excommunicated by the Jewish community in Amsterdam. He ceased to regard himself as a Jew. He has sometimes been accused of having been hostile to Judaism and to Jews. I, Strauss writes, do not find that he was more opposed to Judaism than to Christianity, for example, and I do not find that he was hostile to Jews. He acquired a strange, or perhaps not so strange, neutrality in regard to the secular conflict between Judaism and Christianity. Looking at the Jews and the Jewish fate from this neutral point of view, he even made some suggestions as to the redemption of the Jews. One suggestion is almost explicit. After having asserted that the Jews have not been elected in any other sense than that in which the Canaanites too had been elected earlier, and that therefore the Jews had not been elected for eternity, he tries to show that their survival after the loss of the land can be explained in a perfectly natural manner, meaning not one that requires the invocation of God and his providence. In this context, he makes the following remark, quote, "If the foundations of their religion did not effeminate their minds, I would absolutely believe that they might again restore their state under auspicious circumstances, considering the fact that human things are mutable," unquote. Which means, Strauss continues, the hope for divine redemption is altogether baseless. The sufferings of the exiles are altogether meaningless. There's no guarantee whatsoever that these sufferings will ever cease. But the first condition for entertaining any reasonable hope for the end of the exile is that the Jews should get rid of the foundations of their religion, that is to say, of the spirit of Judaism. For that spirit, Spinoza thought, is adverse to warlike enterprise and to the energy of government. As far as I know, Strauss says, this is the earliest suggestion of a purely political solution to the Jewish problem. The substitution of a purely political solution for the miracle of redemption toward which men can contribute, if at all, only by a life of piety. It is the first inkling of unqualifiedly political Zionism. Okay, so you understand what Strauss is saying? Spinoza was the first person to suggest a political solution to the Jewish exile, as opposed to a traditional view of a pious redemption. But, Strauss adds, Spinoza intimated still another solution. In his theological political treatise, he sketches the outline of what he regarded as a decent society. That society, as described by him, can be characterized as a liberal democracy. Incidentally, Spinoza may be said to be the first philosopher who advocated liberal democracy. Spinoza still regarded it as necessary to underwrite liberal democracy with a public religion or a state religion. Now, it is very remarkable that religion, that state religion, which is emphatically not a religion of reason, is neither Christian nor Jewish. It is neutral in regard to the differences between Judaism and Christianity. Furthermore, Spinoza claims to have proved on the basis of the Bible that the Mosaic law was binding only for the period of the Jewish Commonwealth. If one considers these two facts, first, that the state religion is neutral in regard to the differences between Judaism and Christianity, and second, that the Mosaic law is no longer binding, one is entitled to say that Spinoza laid the foundation for another purely political solution of the Jewish problem, in fact, for the alternative to political Zionism and the solution known as assimilationism. Okay, as I mentioned, Spinoza is an important figure for Strauss, has a book on him in the collection of essays called Liberalism, Ancient and Modern. You can read an astounding piece of writing by Strauss, which was the preface to his book on Spinoza, which has some of the only autobiographical remarks you'll find in Strauss's writing. But here, what's he saying? Spinoza is responsible for two things: abandoning traditional Judaism, the traditional view of return, of repentance, going back, for two different kinds of political solution. One, political Zionism. The Jews can establish a state of their own, which will have nothing to do with providential history, but will be merely having to do with the mutability of political things and the nature of political life, on one hand. And on the other hand, solving the Jewish problem, assimilating the Jews in a public religion that is neutral as to the difference between Judaism and Christianity. In other words, a kind of liberal democratic solution, according to Strauss. Continuing, in Spinoza's liberal democracy, Jews do not have to become baptized in order to acquire full citizen rights. By the way, I should just say here in passing, excuse me while I interject once more. Even though Strauss is talking about Jewish figures and Jewish themes, as I've already said before in the stream, the topics, the themes, the problems, the issues, the nature of the solution, the suggestions, the alternatives, all of that is more broadly applicable than to just the Jews, and it can be seen in a broader lens than just through the Jewish lens. So, the political, Strauss once wrote, I wish I had the exact quote, I'll quote as best I can from memory, that, you may like this, you may not like it, but I'll just tell you the point of it. He says, the Jews are, in every sense, the Jews are in fact the chosen people, in the sense that the Jewish problem really starkly represents the human problem to the extent that it's a political problem. Formulation along those lines. So in other words, when he's thinking about the political question of progress or return, the belonging to a community of faith that's structured by a law, the criticism of that tradition that Spinoza gave, which called into question the possibility of revelation, the meaning of miracles, and so on. All of this is, again, much more broad than just a concern with Judaism. For those of you who think he's talking too much here about the Jewish angle in particular, you should know for Strauss it has a much more general significance, as well as what he mentions here explicitly. So to continue, in Spinoza's liberal democracy, Jews do not have to become baptized in order to acquire full citizen rights. It is sufficient if they accept the extremely latitudinarian state religion, and they may then forget about the Mosaic law. In this neutral atmosphere, the sufferings of the exiles could be expected to wither away. Jews wouldn't be persecuted because they would just be citizens like everybody else. Spinoza has merely intimated the two classical alternatives which followed from the radical break with Judaism. The practical consequences were fully developed in the course of the 19th century, but when they were exposed to the test of practice, they led into certain difficulties. So now Strauss, we can imagine, is going to tell us about the difficulties of these two solutions, and we begin with assimilationism. On the premise of assimilationism, Jewish suffering for Judaism, becomes meaningless. That suffering is merely the residue of a benighted past, a residue which will cease in proportion as mankind makes further progress. Like you seem a bit like an idiot or a clown or a fool if you're suffering for some old tradition in a progressive age where you've been liberated from all old obligations. Okay, that's the idea here. But the results were somewhat disappointing. The decrease of the power of Christianity did not bring about the expected decrease of anti-Jewish feeling. Even where legal equality of the Jews became a fact, it contrasted all the more strongly with the social inequality which continued. In a number of countries, legal inequality and the cruder forms of social inequality gave way to subtler forms of social inequality, but the social inequality did not for this reason become less of a hardship. On the contrary, sensitivity increased with social assent. Our ancestors had been immune to hatred and contempt because it merely proved to them the election of Israel. Okay, according to the traditional faith, there's a sort of belief embedded that the people are going to hate you because you've been, for theological reasons, let's say. The uprooted, assimilated Jew had nothing to oppose to hatred and contempt except his naked self. Full social equality proved to require the complete disappearance of the Jews as Jews, a proposition which is impracticable if for no other reason than at least for the perfectly sufficient one of simple self-respect. Why should we, Jews, Strauss writes, who have a heroic past behind us and within us, which is not second to that of any other group anywhere on earth, deny or forget that past? That past which is all the more heroic, one could say, since its chief characters are not the glitter and trappings of martial glory and of cultural splendor, although it does not lack even these. I interject. Never mind. Assimilation proved to require inner enslavement as the price of external freedom. Or to put it somewhat differently, assimilationism seemed to land the Jews into the bog of Philistinism, of shallow satisfaction with the most unsatisfactory present. I'll just pause here. Anybody today who seeks to assert a particular cultural heritage, legacy, or tradition and identity faces a similar sort of problem here that, not identical, but similar. So why do you defend your particular identity? Why do you have any positive significance attached to your cultural particularity when you could just merge into the great sea of humanity? In the case of the Jews, Strauss is indicating here, quoting now back from the essay, a most inglorious end for a people which had been led out of the house of bondage into the desert with careful avoidance of the land of the Philistines, although to quote, and it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. End quote. It is always near. Okay, the threat of Philistinism, the presence of Philistinism. Once progress was indeed achieved, hatred of the Jews could no longer present itself among educated or half-educated people as hatred of the Jews. It had to disguise itself as anti-Semitism, a term invented by some bashful German or French pedant of the 19th century. It is certainly a most improper term. The shock administered by the continued existence of social inequality and by the emergence of anti-Semitism, especially in Germany and France, proved to be a fair warning for what was going to happen in Germany, especially between 1933 and 1945. Those European Jews who realized that assimilation was no solution to the Jewish problem and looked out for another purely human or political solution turned to political Zionism, okay, the project of statehood. But political Zionism led to difficulties of its own. The basic idea underlying purely political Zionism was not Zionist at all. It could have been satisfied by a Jewish state anywhere on earth. I'll keep reading, but I want to comment, but I'll keep reading for now. Political Zionism was already a concession to the Jewish tradition. Those who were seeking a solution of the Jewish problem other than the disappearance of the Jews had to accept not only the territory hallowed by Jewish tradition, but its language, Hebrew as well. They were forced to accept, furthermore, Jewish culture. Okay, so in a minute, he's going to transition from political Zionism to cultural Zionism, but I want to say something about this for those of you who don't really care about the Jewish side of the question. What is a purely political solution? Okay, because what does he say, right? Spinoza invented a purely political solution to the Jewish problem. Liberal democracy on one hand, political Zionism on the other. What's the problem with a purely political solution? Well, in the specific case of the Jews, it's that the Jewish tradition, as we're going to see in a minute, doesn't see itself in purely political terms. Now, that's for the Jewish tradition. But you watching here, you traditionalists, if that's what you are, conservative revolutionaries, if that's what you are, or whoever you happen to be, the problem, as I say, is general. Because as soon as you start thinking beyond the merely political realm of the question, and you start saying, for example, that you want to honor the Christian tradition or the Islamic tradition or some other tradition, that you want your political values or your political morality and ethics to be informed by a divine code or a divine heritage, then you're out of the realm of the strictly political. You're into the realm of political theology. You're into a different sort of realm here. And so that's what Strauss, these are the conceptual distinctions that are relevant here. For those of you who think that, quote unquote, nobody cares about the, let's say, merely historiological side of this question. Okay, so I want that to be very clear to you. All right, so political Zionism led to the following problem. It led to the fact that it basically transforms, as he writes here, into cultural Zionism. So let's see. Cultural Zionism became a very powerful rival of political Zionism, but the heritage to which cultural Zionism had recourse rebelled against being interpreted in terms of culture or civilization, meaning as an autonomous product of the genius of the Jewish people. Okay, I'll read a few more sentences, then I'll stop and comment to make sure it's crystal clear. That culture or civilization had its core in the Torah, and the Torah presents itself as given by God, not created by Israel. Thus, the attempt to solve the Jewish problem by purely human means ended in failure. Let me just elaborate because I think this point is interesting for you, whoever you are, wherever you come from, and as I say, wherever you stand on Israel and the Jews. The purely political has been separated from the divine or the theological. It's been separated from a deep destiny. So it gets, let's say, rivaled by or supplanted by a view that takes culture into account. We want to preserve our culture. I think this is a common enough notion for those of you out there, right? We want to preserve our culture against the attack of progressivism. But there's a subtle philosophical point that Strauss makes in what he just said, which is that what's implied by culture is that culture is the product of human subjectivity, the product of human ingenuity, and so on. But the divine traditions do not see themselves as the products of human ingenuity. They see themselves as prior to, as the backdrop for. You see what I'm saying? Culture means, in this presentation, that which man makes. But the divine codes, the divine law, the divine perspective, the realm of the holy, isn't interpreted on its own terms as that which man makes. It's interpreted as that which, as it were, saves man, rescues man. You see the difference in perspective? So that's why cultural Zionism runs into a problem, because it interprets the Torah as a product of the Jewish genius, as a product, as opposed to, as he puts it here, given by God, not made by man. It's a general problem, okay? One of the reasons why before, without any context, I've quoted and suggested that one of the issues with the culture war is the framing of it as a culture war. Because once you see what's presupposed by the language of culture, you recognize there's a whole other realm of problems besides just which side are you on. Are we interpreting culture as the product of human subjectivity and therefore failing to see the dependence of the human being on something greater than the human being? Okay, anyways, I go back to the essay. So, the attempts to solve the Jewish problem by purely human means ended in failure. By the way, we're reading Leo Strauss's Progress in Return. This is going to be a long stream, as I said at the beginning. I appreciate those of you who are here. I hope that you're enjoying it, learning from it, and when you get a chance, visit millermanschool.com. Thus, the attempts to solve the Jewish problem by purely human means ended in failure. The knot which was not tied by man could not be untied by man. I do not believe that the American experience forces us to qualify these statements. It is very far from me to minimize the difference, Strauss says, between a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and the nations of the old world, which certainly were not conceived in liberty. I share the hope in America and the faith in America, but I'm compelled to add that that faith and that hope cannot be of the same character as that faith and that hope which a Jew has in regard to Judaism and which the Christian has in regard to Christianity. No one claims that the faith in America and the hope for America is based on explicit divine promises. Strauss writes, the attempt to solve the Jewish problem has failed because of the overwhelming power of the past. The experience of that power by a generation which had become forgetful of that power is part of what is sometimes called the discovery of history. The discovery was made in the 19th century. As a discovery, it consisted in the realization of something which was not realized previously, that the acceptance of the past or the return to the Jewish tradition is something radically different from a mere continuation of that tradition. It is quite true that Jewish life in the past was almost always more than a continuation of a tradition. Very great changes within that tradition have also taken place in the course of the centuries. But it is also true that the change which we are witnessing today and which all of us are participating in is, in one way or another, qualitatively different from all previous changes within Judaism. So there's something distinct about the period in which Strauss is writing, something distinct about the current crisis or the current situation. Let me try to clarify that difference, he says. Those who today return to Judaism do not assert that, say, Spinoza was altogether wrong. They accept at least the principle of that biblical criticism which was regarded as the major offense of Spinoza. Also, this is going to be a very interesting point that you can apply outside of just the Jewish question here, and you should. I'll encourage you to and help you do so in a minute. Generally speaking, those who today return to Judaism admit that modern rationalism, to use this vague term, has a number of important insights which cannot be thrown overboard and which were alien to the Jewish tradition. Therefore, they modify the Jewish tradition consciously. I'll just pause here. So, Spinoza criticizes the Jewish tradition, and those who return to Judaism today return as post-Spinozan. You know what I mean? Incorporating some of the insights of Spinoza's criticism so that the return takes place on a completely different basis than it had done before. So too with the return to Islam, we can assume, imagine and extend the return to Christianity or the return to some other tradition, capital T. Strauss is saying in the narrowly Jewish context that it takes place now after Spinoza on the basis of his criticism in a modified way, and maybe therefore is somehow illegitimate, as we'll see his own formulation here, okay? So they modify the Jewish tradition consciously. You only have to contrast that with the procedure of Maimonides in the 12th century, who, when introducing Aristotelian philosophy into Judaism, had to assume that he was merely recovering Israel's own lost inheritance. In other words, he preserves the basic principles of Judaism even as he brings Aristotelianism into it. These present-day Jews who return to the tradition try to do, in the element of reflection, what traditionally was done unconsciously or naively. Their attitude is historical rather than traditional. They study the thought of the past as thought of the past, and therefore not as necessarily binding on the present generation as it stands. You see, there's been a modification in their attitude towards the past. It's could no longer have the fullness of truth. It's now treated historically. Very important shift for Strauss. Continuing, thus the question arises as to the relative importance of these two elements, the new element and the unchanged element. The new element being the fact that present-day Judaism is forced to be what has been called post-critical, or like I said in my remarks, post-Spinozan. Are we wiser than our ancestors in the decisive respect, or only in a subordinate respect? In the first case, we still would have to claim that we have made decisive progress. You know, your ancestors believed that the Bible was literally true, and you understand that it was written by 4 or 5 different authors, compiled over a period of many decades and centuries, and that it reflected a naive belief in the possibility of miracles, and so on and so on. That would be a hugely relevant difference where you would see yourself as superior to and having progressed beyond your naively innocent ancestors. So this is the issue, you see. If that's the case, then we've made progress. But if the insights implied in the quote-unquote post-critical character of present-day Judaism are only of a subordinate character, the movement which we're witnessing can justly claim to be a return. Now, this movement of return would not have had the effect which it had, but for the fact that not only among Jews, but throughout the Western world more generally, progress has become a matter of doubt. You see, I've pointed out several times that the issues here are much more general than just the Jewish one, and Strauss does the same here. The term progress, in its full and emphatic meaning, has practically disappeared from serious literature. People speak less and less of progress and more of change. They no longer claim to know that we're moving in the right direction. Not progress, but the belief in progress or the idea of progress as a social or historical phenomenon is a major theme for the present-day student of society. A generation or so ago, the most famous study on the subject was called The Idea of Progress. Its opposite number in present-day literature is entitled The Belief in Progress. The substitution of belief for idea is in itself worthy of note. Now, to understand the crisis of the belief in progress, we must first clarify the content of that belief. So let me just pause for a minute, mostly because I want to take a drink of coffee, put the chat on here. We're reading Leo Strauss's Progress or Return. He set out the problem in terms of teshuvah, return, repentance in the Jewish tradition. The meaning of that repentance as first following the break that follows Spinoza's biblical criticism, where he shows that the Bible is not to be believed as a divine revelation, and asks the question whether the biblical criticism has made an essential or a secondary contribution to our understanding of the problem. And now he's turning to a more general discussion of the nature of progressivism and of the progressive orthodoxy, the progressive belief in principles. So thanks those of you who are here. We're going to continue through the essay in a moment, just taking a quick breather. Feel free to comment, like, share, subscribe, and support my work if you'd like at millermanschool.com, where I have a new free introduction to philosophy. Okay, continuing. What is progress? Now, progress in the emphatic sense presupposes that there's something which is simply good, or the end, as the goal of progress. Progress is change in the direction of the end. But this is only the necessary, not the sufficient condition of the idea of progress. A sign of this is the notion of the golden age, which also presupposes a notion of the simply good, but that simply good, that end, is here located in the beginning. The end of man, the simply good, must be understood in a specific manner if it is to become the basis of the idea of progress. I suggest, Strauss writes, that the end of man must be understood primarily as perfection of the understanding, in such a manner that the perfection of the understanding is somehow akin to the arts and crafts. It has always been controversial whether man's beginning was perfect or imperfect, but both parties to the controversy admitted that the arts and the crafts, and certainly their perfection, do not belong to man's beginning. In other words, the various arts develop. They become sharpened, more precise, more refined over time. Therefore, to decide the question, regardless of the perfection or imperfection of man's beginning, depends upon how the question of the value of the arts and crafts is decided. At any rate, the idea of progress presupposes that there is the simply good life and that the beginning of life is radically imperfect. Accordingly, we find in Greek science or philosophy a full consciousness of progress, In the first place of progress achieved and its inevitable concomitant, looking down on the inferiority or the weakness of the ancients, and as regards future progress. So now Strauss is going to give us an example from Greek science or philosophy of the recognition of progress. Aristotle himself noted, quote, "In the art of medicine, there's no limit to the pursuit of health. And in the other arts, there's no limit to the pursuit of their several ends, for they aim at accomplishing their ends to the uttermost," unquote. The possibility of infinite progress, at least in certain respects, is here stated. Okay, you all see that? The arts are subject to infinite development and infinite progress, but is human life to be thought of as an art or on the parallel with the arts? What is the status of the arts in the question of the good life? You see? A deeper question than we're used to posing. So the possibility of infinite progress, at least in certain respects, is here stated, yet the idea of progress is different from the Greek conception of progress. What is the relative importance of fulfillment on the one hand and future progress on the other? The most elaborate statements on progress seemed to occur in Lucretius and Seneca, where the possibility of infinite progress in the sciences and arts is clearly stated. Yet, Lucretius was an Epicurean, and Seneca was a Stoic, which means they both presupposed that the fundamental issue had been settled already, either by Epicurus or by the Stoa. No future progress then in the decisive respect is envisioned. Okay, you get that point? So one's an Epicurean, the other's a Stoic. To the extent to which they think Epicurus got the fundamental questions right, or to the extent to which they think that the Stoics got the fundamental questions right. In other words, if the fundamental questions are right, you're not going to progress beyond them, even though in some other sense there might be progress in some lesser sense. Generally speaking, it seems that in classical thought, the decisive questions were thought to have been answered as far as they can be answered. The only exception of which I know, Strauss writes, is Plato, who held that the fulfillment proper, namely full wisdom, is not possible, but only quest for wisdom, which in Greek means philosophy. He also insisted that there are no assignable limits to that quest for wisdom, and therefore it follows from Plato's notion that indefinite progress is possible in principle. Hitherto, I, Strauss writes, have spoken of intellectual progress. What about social progress? Are they parallel? The idea that they are necessarily parallel or that intellectual progress is accompanied in principle by social progress was known to the classics. We find there the idea that the art of legislation, which is the overarching social art, progresses like any other art. Yet Aristotle, who reports this doctrine, questions this solution. I'll say something about this in a minute. And he notes the radical difference between laws and arts or intellectual pursuits. More generally stated, or more simply stated, he, Aristotle, notes the radical difference between the requirements of social life and the requirements of intellectual life. Okay, Strauss is referring to Aristotle's Politics. I have a course on it, aristotlecourse.com. And in Aristotle's Politics, Aristotle raises the question whether you can think of law the same way that you think of art, as constantly progressing. And in art, where, for example, innovation is a good thing and constant innovation is desirable, Aristotle argues explicitly that constant innovation would not be desirable in law, because law requires the habit of obedience in order to be effective. And constant innovation, replacing one law by another all the time, undermines the habit of obedience. It deprives law of its specific character. And so Aristotle says quite clearly, you should not think of law on analogy with the arts. Legislation does not have that kind of a technical character. Very good discussion in Aristotle's Politics that Strauss is referring to here. More generally stated, more simply stated, he notes the radical difference between the requirements of social life and the requirements of intellectual life. The paramount requirement of society is stability, as distinguished from progress. You know, I want you to think about that too, in terms of all of the progressivist causes today and all of the opposition in the culture war around them. Just listen to this sentence. The paramount requirement of society is stability, as distinguished from progress. If I summarize this point, in the classical conception of progress, it is clearly admitted that infinite intellectual progress in secondary matters is theoretically possible. But we must add immediately there's no practical possibility for that. For according to the one school, The visible universe is of finite duration. It has come into being and will perish again. And according to the other view, which held that the visible universe is eternal, they asserted, especially Aristotle, that there are periodic cataclysms which will destroy all earlier civilization. Hence, eternal recurrence of the same progressive process, followed by decay and destruction. So what does Strauss say here? A point that maybe you think is too general, too abstract. Infinite progress is checked by the destruction of the universe or by the periodic cataclysms. So that seems far removed from what you might expect to happen tomorrow. But when you're thinking through the meaning of unchecked, unlimited progress, you have to take even those distant possibilities into account. Now, what is lacking in the classical conception as compared to the modern, Strauss writes? What's the difference between classical progressivism, as it were, and modern progressivism? I see 2 points, he says. First, there is lacking the notion of a guaranteed parallelism between intellectual and social progress. In other words, modern progressives think that progression on the intellectual level, in other words, you could say the more people become interested in progressivist theory, the more society itself will positively progress. They don't see the possibility of those two things moving in opposite directions, whereas the classics did. Here we go. The guaranteed parallelism between social and intellectual progress. In the classical statements about progress, the emphasis is upon intellectual progress rather than social progress. The basic idea can be stated as follows. Science or philosophy is the preserve of a small minority, okay, the few and the rare, I add parenthetically, of those who have good natures, as they called it, who are gifted, as we say. Their progress, the progress of this tiny minority, does not necessarily affect society at large, far from it. It was this thought which was radically challenged in the 17th century, the beginning of modern philosophy, and with the introduction of the crucial notion of the idea of method. Listen to this. This is the kind of reflection that I think is so valuable to hear from Strauss that we might not think of in these terms ordinarily. So listen to what he's saying. Classical philosophy saw progress for the few and the rare, the gifted philosophical natures, the special, talented, as it were, chosen ones. But that progress of this small group was replaced by the idea of method. Why? Method brings about the leveling of the natural differences of the mind, and methods can be learned in principle by everyone. Only discovery remains the preserve of the few, but the acquisition of the results of the discovery, and especially of the discovery of methods, is open to all. And there was a very simple proof. Mathematical problems which formerly could not be solved by the greatest mathematical geniuses are now solved by high school boys. The level of intelligence, that was the conclusion, has enormously been raised. And since this is possible, there's a necessary parallelism between intellectual and social progress. It no longer depends upon a rare nature. It can, as it were, be democratized by method. As for the second point, by the way, thanks for being here. I hope you're enjoying this. We're reading Leo Strauss's Progress or Return. As for the second point, the guarantee of an infinite future on Earth, not interrupted by telluric catastrophes, we find this thought fully developed in the 18th century. The human race had a beginning, but no end. And it began about 7,000 years ago. You see, Strauss writes that man did not accept the biblical chronology. Hence, since man is only 7,000 years old, it is still in its infancy. An infinite future is open, and look at what we've achieved in this short span compared with infinity of 7,000 years. The decisive point is then this: there's a beginning and no end. Obviously, the argument presupposes a beginning, otherwise you cannot figure out this infinite progress. The origin of this idea, a beginning but no end, could perhaps be found in Plato's dialogue Timaeus, if one takes that literally. Yet, Plato certainly admitted regular telluric catastrophes. The source, I think, has to be found, he says, in a certain interpretation of the Bible, which we find, for example, in Maimonides, where you have the beginning, the creation, and no end, and cataclysms are excluded, not by natural necessity, but by the covenant of God with Noah. You remember that, right? God promises no longer to destroy humankind and all of that. Where are we here? Yeah. Yet precisely on the basis of the Bible, the beginning cannot be imperfect. Moreover, such additional important notions as the power of sin and the need for greater redemption counter the effect of the notion of progress necessarily. Then again, in the Bible, the core of the process from the beginning to the end is not progress. There's a classic past, whether we seek it at Mount Sinai or in the patriarchs or wherever else. Furthermore, and quite obviously, The core of the process as presented in the Bible is not intellectual scientific development. The availability of infinite time for infinite progress appears then to be guaranteed by a document of revelation, which condemns the other crucial elements of the idea of progress. Progress in the full and emphatic sense of the term is a hybrid notion. I just want to explain that point once more. Strauss says, what are the principles or premises of the idea of progress? A beginning, which was imperfect, no end, and no cataclysms. You have a beginning which was imperfect. You have an infinitely open horizon. And you have nothing that will stop or reverse or destroy the elements of the progress along the way. Where do we have an idea that's even close to that? A beginning, you have in the Bible. An open future with no cataclysms because God has guaranteed it in his covenant with Noah. But the beginning was not imperfect in the sense in which it is for the non-biblical progressivists. So you can start to sort of schematize or tabulate the nature of the premises in this quote-unquote politics of origins. Progress in the full and emphatic sense of the term is a hybrid notion. This difficulty, continuing with Strauss's essay, explains why the idea of progress underwent a radical modification in the 19th century. I quote one specimen, quote, "Truth can no longer be found in a collection of fixed dogmatic propositions, but only in the process of knowing, which process ascends from the lower to even higher stages. All those stages are only perishable phases in the endless development from the lower to the higher. There is no final absolute truth, no final absolute stage of the development. Nothing is imperishable except for the uninterrupted process of the coming and perishing of the endless ascent from the lower to the higher. We do not have to consider here the question as to whether this view agrees with the present state of natural science, for at present natural science predicts a possible end to the existence of the earth and a certain end to the inhabitability of the earth. Natural science therefore assumes today that human history consists not only of an ascending but also of a descending process. However this may be, we are certainly still rather remote from the point where decline begins to set in," unquote. That statement was made by Friedrich Engels, the friend and co-worker of Karl Marx. Here we see infinite progress proper is abandoned, but the grave consequences of that are evaded by a wholly incomprehensible and unjustifiable quote-unquote never mind. Like, yeah, maybe not, but let's not think about it. This more recent form of the belief in progress is based on the decision just to forget about the end, to forget about eternity. The contemporary crisis of Western civilization, that's why we're reading this, by the way, the contemporary crisis of Western civilization may be said to be identical with the climactic crisis of the idea of progress in the full and emphatic sense of the term. I repeat, Strauss writes, that idea consists of the following elements. The development of human thought as a whole is a progressive development. Certainly the emergence of modern thought since the 17th century marks an unqualified progress beyond all earlier thought. Next, there's a fundamental and necessary parallelism between intellectual and social progress. There are no assignable limits to intellectual and social progress. Infinite intellectual and social progress is actually possible. These are all principles that Strauss is stating. Once mankind has reached a certain stage of development, there exists a solid floor beneath which man can no longer sink. All these points have become questionable, I believe, to all of us. To mention only one point, perhaps the most massive one, the idea of progress was bound up with the notion of the conquest of nature, of man making himself the master and owner of nature for the purpose of relieving man's estate. The means for that goal was a new science. We all know of the enormous successes of the new science and of the technology which is based on it, and we all can witness the enormous increase of man's power. Modern man is a giant in comparison to earlier man, but we have also to note that there is no corresponding increase in wisdom and goodness. Modern man is a giant of whom we do not know whether he is better or worse than earlier man. More than that, this development of modern science culminated in the view that man is not able to distinguish in a responsible manner between good and evil, the famous value judgment. Nothing can be said responsibly about the right use of that immense power. Modern man is a blind giant. The doubt of progress led to a crisis of Western civilization as a whole, because in the course of the 19th century, the old distinction between good and bad or good and evil had been progressively replaced by the distinction between progressive and reactionary, which I think you're all familiar with, except now instead of reactionary, you're called fascist. No simple, inflexible, eternal distinction between good and bad could give assurance to those who had learned to take their bearings only by the distinction between progressive and reactionary, as soon as these people had become doubtful of progress. The substitution of the distinction between progressive and reactionary for the distinction between good and bad is another aspect of the discovery of history to which I referred before. You see, no longer taking your bearings by the question of good and bad, because suddenly you start to think that all value judgments, all categories of moral evaluation are products of a history designed to include or exclude, to oppress or to dominate. And suddenly you're no longer concerned with the simple question of good and bad, good and evil, right and wrong, just and unjust. I think you're all very familiar with the consequences of that modification, or that substitution of the distinction between progressive and reactionary for the distinction between good and bad. The discovery of history, to state this very simply, Strauss says, is identical with the substitution of the past or the future for the eternal, the substitution of the temporal for the eternal. Now, to understand this crisis of Western civilization, one cannot leave it at understanding the problematic character of the idea of progress, for the idea of progress is only a part or an aspect of a larger whole of what we shall not hesitate to call modernity. And by the way, here's where Strauss and Heidegger and Dugin, Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rousseau, and the other figures that I teach at my school and discuss on this channel come together, each in their own way, with a big question mark over the meaning of modernity, and certainly over the question whether it's been nothing but good. So the problem of progress stands under a more general or larger problem of modernity. What is modernity? A hard question which cannot be discussed in detail here. Strauss writes, however, I would like to offer one or two somewhat rambling considerations. First, one might remember the decisive steps which led up to the contemporary crisis of Western civilization. And to those who are familiar with these things, I must apologize, he says, for the superficiality of what is now offered in brief, but I think it is important to recall these things nevertheless. Therefore, regard this as a stenogram, not an analysis. So you should know Strauss wrote about this question many times in many different contexts, and here he's apologizing, as it were, for the fact that he's going to repeat himself and that he's going to do so in a summary form. And let's take a look at that, especially those of you who are unfamiliar with Strauss. This may be a helpful summary indeed. Western civilization has two roots, the Bible and Greek philosophy. Let us begin by looking at the first of these elements, the Bible, the biblical element. Modern rationalism rejected biblical theology and replaced it by such things as deism, pantheism, atheism. But in this process, biblical morality was in a way preserved. Goodness was still believed to consist in something like justice, benevolence, love, or charity. And modern rationalism has generated a tendency to believe that this biblical morality is better preserved if it is divorced from biblical theology. Now, this was, of course, more visible in the 19th century than it is today. It is no longer so visible today because one crucial event happened around 1870-1880, the appearance of Nietzsche. Nietzsche's criticism can be reduced to one proposition: modern man has been trying to preserve biblical morality while abandoning biblical faith. That is impossible. If the biblical faith goes, biblical morality must go too, and a radically different morality must be accepted. The word which Nietzsche used is the will to power. Nietzsche meant it in a very subtle and noble manner, yet the crude and ignoble way in which it was later understood is not altogether independent of the radical change of orientation he suggested. As for the other major component of Western civilization, the classical element, that is the idea of philosophy or science. That too began to change. In the 17th century, a new philosophy and a new science began to emerge. They made the same claims as all earlier philosophy and science had done, but the result of this 17th century revolution produced something which had never existed before, the emergence of science with a capital S. Originally, the attempt had been to replace traditional philosophy and science by a new philosophy and a new science, but in the course of a few generations, it appeared that only part of the new philosophy and science was successful, and indeed amazingly successful. No one could question these developments, for example, Newton's, but only part of the new science or philosophy was successful. And then the great distinction between philosophy and science, which we're all familiar with, came into being. Because it's very important for Strauss. He often says philosophy and science originally were one thing and meant one thing. But in the modern project to establish a new philosophy and a new science, the scientific part proved to be much more successful than the philosophic part. And then we have this split that he's about to mention. Science is the successful part of modern philosophy or science, and philosophy is the unsuccessful part, the rump. Science is therefore higher in dignity than philosophy. The consequence, which you know, is the depreciation of all knowledge which is not scientific in this peculiar sense. Science becomes the authority for philosophy in a way perfectly comparable to the way in which theology was the authority for philosophy in the Middle Ages. Science is, on this view, the perfection of man's natural understanding of the world, but then certain things took place in the 19th century, for example, the discovery of non-Euclidean geometry and its use in physics, which made it clear that science cannot be described adequately as the perfection of man's natural understanding of the world, but rather as a radical modification of man's natural understanding of the world. In other words, science is based on certain fundamental hypotheses which, being hypotheses, are not absolutely necessary and which always remain hypothetical. The consequence was again drawn most clearly by Nietzsche, so let me just remind you. Nietzsche is so important that he drew the consequence of the crisis of the biblical faith, and here he draws the consequence of the meaning of modern science. You start to get a sense of the importance of Nietzsche for Strauss. Science, Nietzsche draws the following consequence. Science is only one interpretation of the world among many. It has certain advantages, but that, of course, does not give it any ultimately superior cognitive status. The last consequence stated by some men in our age is, as you know, modern science is in no way superior to Greek science, as little as modern poetry is superior to Greek poetry. In other words, even science with its enormous prestige, a prestige higher than any other power in the modern world, is also kind of a giant with feet of clay, if you consider its foundations. As a consequence of this chain of scientific development, the notion of a rational morality, the heritage of Greek philosophy, has, to repeat myself, Strauss writes, lost its standing completely. All choices are, it is argued, ultimately non-rational or irrational. If you're one of those hundreds of thousands, or I guess now millions of people who have recently watched the film What is a Woman, I think you somehow see the consequences of all of this, the crisis of the biblical faith, for sure, but also the crisis of rationality, the crisis of the meaning of science, and for sure, the crisis of the notion of a rational morality, replaced by the assertion that all choices are ultimately non-rational or irrational. The immediate cause of the decline of the belief in progress, before I go on to section 2 here, great to be with you. I'm Michael Millerman, millermanschool.com. We're reading Leo Strauss's essay, Progress or Return. I said at the outset of the stream it would be a long one, and yet sometimes we do things that are short and frivolous, sometimes we do things that are long and serious. This is the latter occasion. Like, subscribe, share, repost, and certainly visit millermanschool.com and read Leo Strauss on your own, as well as being with me as I read him on this channel. I think there's a lot we can learn from him. The immediate cause of the decline of the belief in progress can perhaps be stated as follows. The idea of progress in the modern sense implies that once man has reached a certain level, intellectual and social or moral, there exists a firm level of being below which he cannot sink. This contention, however, is empirically refuted by the incredible barbarization which we have been so unfortunate as to witness in our century. We can say that the idea of progress in the full and emphatic sense of the term is based on wholly unwarranted hopes. You can see this even in many critics of the idea of progress. One of the most famous critics of the idea of progress prior to the First World War was the Frenchman Georges Sorel, who wrote a book, The Delusions of Progress. But strangely, Sorel declared that the decline of the Western world was impossible because of the vitality of the Western tradition. I think that we have all now become sufficiently sober to admit that whatever may be wrong in Spangler, and there are many things wrong in Spangler, that the very title in the English translation, especially of the work, is more sober, more reasonable than these hopes which lasted so long. Okay, in other words, we now have a sense in which the quote-unquote decline of the West seems like a more sober, more reasonable than a hope in the regeneration of the West. This barbarization, which we have witnessed, and which we continue to witness, is not altogether accidental. The intention of the modern development was, of course, to bring about a higher civilization, a civilization which would surpass all earlier civilizations. Yet the effect of the modern development was different. What has taken place in the modern period has been a gradual corrosion and destruction of the heritage of Western civilization. The soul of the modern development, one may say, is a peculiar quote-unquote realism. The notion that moral principles and the appeal to moral principles, preaching, sermonizing, is ineffectual, and therefore that one has to seek a substitute for moral principles, which would be much more efficacious than ineffectual preaching. Such substitutes were found, for example, in institutions or in economics, and perhaps the most important substitute is what was called the historical process, meaning that the historical process is in a way a much more important guarantee for the actualization of the good life than what the individual could or would do through his own efforts. This change shows itself, as already noted, in the change of general language, namely in the substitution of the distinction between progressive and reactionary for the distinction between good and bad. You know, you're a fascist if you want to go back to any period other than the one we're in now. The implication being that we have to choose and to do what is conducive to progress, what is in agreement with the historical trends, and it is indecent or immoral to be squeamish in such adaptations. Again, I think What is a Woman is a good topical example of that, but there are many more that I'm sure you know of that come to mind, and that'll be as relevant when you're watching this 5 or 10 years down the road. Once it became clear, however, that historical trends are absolutely ambiguous and therefore cannot serve as a standard, or in other words, that to jump on the bandwagon or the wave of the future is not more reasonable than to resist those trends, no standard whatever was left. The facts understood as historical processes indeed do not teach us anything regarding values, and the consequence of the abandonment of moral principle proper was that value judgments have no objective support whatsoever. To spell this out with the necessary clarity, although one knows this from the study of the social sciences, the values of barbarism and cannibalism are as defensible as those of civilization. So if you think there's no rational standard for your moral judgments or preferences, then you can't distinguish between, or as Strauss once put it, cannibalism becomes a matter of taste. As I have spoken of modernity as of something definite and hence knowable, I have, he says, spoken of modernity as of something definite and hence knowable. An analysis of this phenomenon is out of the question here, as goes without saying. You can read other of Strauss's essays, like The Three Waves of Modernity, for example, What is Political Philosophy, or Natural Right and History. Instead, I would like briefly to enumerate those characteristic elements of modernity which are particularly striking, at least to me, Strauss writes, but I must make one observation in order to protect myself against gross misunderstanding. Modern phenomenon is not characterized by the fact that it is located, say, between 1600 and 1952, because pre-modern traditions, of course, survived and survive. And more than that, throughout the modern period, there has been a constant movement against this modern trend. From the very beginning, one phenomenon which is very well known, perhaps unduly well known, is the quarrel between the ancients and moderns at the end of the 17th century, which in its most well-known form was concerned with the relatively unimportant question of whether the French drama of the 17th century was really comparable to the classical drama. The real quarrel between the ancients and moderns did not concern the drama, of course, but concerned modern science and philosophy. But there was a resistance to that from the very beginning. The greatest man in English letters who represented this is Swift, Jonathan Swift. But then you have it again very strongly in German classicism in the second half of the 18th century. And then indeed in the 19th century, this movement, this counter-movement, was completely pushed to the wall as a great intellectual movement. But in a way, of course, the tradition still persisted. So, having made clear that by modernity I do not mean something which is simply chronological, let me now indicate what I think are the most striking elements of modernity in a purely enumerative fashion without attempting an analysis. Quick point here relating this to Dugin, for those of you who read him and follow him, are interested in him. Dugin, too, when he treats modernity, treats it as a structure of thought, a system of principles, axioms, ideas, hypotheses. It's a logos. It's, as it were, a worldview. It's not just a period in time. Okay, and Strauss is saying the same thing here. We're trying to understand modernity not just as a historical period, but as an outlook, as a configuration of thought. Okay, as something in that sense. Okay, where am I at here? The first characteristic feature of modern thought, as modern thought, one can say, is its anthropocentric character. Although apparently contradicted by the fact that modern science with its Copernicanism is much more radically anti-anthropocentric than earlier thought, a closer study shows that this is not true. When I speak of the anthropocentric character of modern thought, Strauss writes, I contrast it with the theocentric character of biblical and medieval thought and the cosmocentric character of classical thought. You see this most clearly if you look at modern philosophy. Modern philosophy, which, while it does not have the general authority which modern science has, is nevertheless a kind of conscience or consciousness of modern science. One has only to look at the titles of the most famous books of modern philosophy to see that philosophy is or tends to become analysis of the human mind. You could also see this same trait easily, but that would be too laborious, by looking at what philosophical disciplines emerged in modern times that were unknown to earlier philosophy, all parts of the philosophy of man or of the human mind. So Strauss is adducing this as evidence of the anthropocentrism of modern thought. The underlying idea, which shows itself not in all places clearly, but in some places very clearly, is that all truths or all meaning, all order, all beauty originate in the thinking subject, in human thought, in man. Some famous formulations: we know only what we make, Hobbes. Understanding prescribes nature its laws, Kant. I have discovered a spontaneity little known previously of the monads of the thoughts, Leibniz. To give you a very simple, popular example, certain human pursuits which were formerly called imitative arts are now called creative arts. One must not forget that even the atheistic, materialistic thinkers of classical antiquity took it for granted that man is subject to something higher than himself, for example, the whole cosmic order, and that man is not the origin of all meaning. Okay, we talked about that point earlier. The focus on culture is the focus on man as the creator or origin of his cultural artifacts. That's a kind of anthropocentrism, as opposed to theocentrism or cosmocentrism. Connected with this anthropocentric character is a radical change of moral orientation, which we see with particular clarity in the fact of the emergence of the concepts of rights in the precise form in which it was developed in modern social thought. Generally speaking, pre-modern thought put the emphasis on duty, and rights, as far as they were mentioned at all, were understood only as derivative from duties and subservient to the fulfillment of duties. In modern times, we find the tendency, again, not always expressed with the greatest clarity, but definitely traceable, to assign the primary place to rights, a phenomenon with which I'm sure you're all very well familiar, and to regard the duties as secondary, if of course very important. This is connected with another fact that in the crucial period of the 17th century, where the change becomes most visible, it is understood that the basic right coincides with a passion. The passions are in a way emancipated, because in the traditional notion, the passion is subordinate to the action, and the action means virtue. The change which we can observe throughout the 17th century in all the most famous revolutionary thinkers is that virtue itself is now understood as a passion. In other words, a notion that virtue is a controlling, refraining, regulating, ordering attitude towards passion, think of the image in Plato's Phaedrus, the horses and the charioteer, is given up when virtue itself is understood as a passion, rather than as its controller, refrainer, regulator, and so on, ruler. This leads to another change which becomes manifest only at a somewhat later age, namely that freedom gradually takes the place of virtue, so that in much present-day thought you find that, of course, freedom is not the same as license, that goes without saying, but that the distinction between freedom and license takes on a different meaning, a radically different meaning. The good life, I'll comment on this in a second, the good life does not consist, as it did according to the earlier notion, in compliance with a pattern antedating the human will, but consists primarily in originating the pattern itself. Okay. Design your own life. Be what you want to be. Originate a pattern. Versus live in accordance with the perfection of your nature. Live in accordance with the highest in you. Fulfill your essence. Or walk in the ways of God. Very huge shift, obviously, from the fulfillment of something pre-given as the end of human striving, or, the world of self-making. The good life does not consist, to repeat, as it did according to the earlier notion, in compliance with a pattern antedating the human will, but consists primarily in originating the pattern itself. The good life does not consist of both a what and a how, but only of a what. To state it somewhat differently, and again, repeating that I'm only enumerating, man has no nature to speak of. In that film, What is a Woman? There's a moment where Matt Walsh is talking to a sociologist, and the sociologist is getting very upset at the inquiry Matt Walsh has into, well, what's true? What is really going on? Who is this person really? What's the truth about the situation? And the social scientist says, you're engaging in what we in the social sciences like to call essentialist language. And, so it's exclusionary, it's reactionary, it's fascist, it's violence, it's oppressive, it's transphobic, and so on. That's the denial of the nature that Strauss is speaking of here. Man has no nature to speak of on this view. He makes himself what he is. Man's very humanity is acquired. That is granted, I think, in many quarters. That is what is absolutely stable. Are certain so-called biological characteristics, even now that's rejected, and perhaps some very elementary psychological characteristics, the character of perception, etc. But all interesting things are not modeled on a pattern antedating human action, but are a product of human activity itself. To repeat here, man's very humanity is acquired. And this leads me to the third point. So let's just review the first 2 points. What was the first point that he said characterizes modernity? It's anthropocentrism. What was the second point? A change in moral orientation, away from duties towards rights. And what's the third point? Third point, which became fully clear only in the 19th century and which is already a kind of corrective of this radical emancipation of man from the superhuman, from the theological or the cosmological. It became ever more clear that man's freedom is inseparable from a radical dependence. Yet this dependence was understood as itself a product of human freedom, and the name for that is history. The so-called discovery of history consists in the realization, or in the alleged realization, that man's freedom is radically limited by his earlier use of his freedom and not by his nature or by the whole order of nature or creation. So once again, the limit, the horizon, that which gives definition to man's freedom, not the cosmos, not God, not nature, but rather history. Where are we at here? This element is, I think, increasing in importance, so much so that today one tends to say that the specific character of modern thought is quote-unquote history, a notion which is, in this form, of course, wholly alien to classical thought or to any pre-modern thought or biblical thought as well, naturally. If I had the time, I would show that precisely in this so-called historicization of modern thought, the problem of modernity becomes most visible from a technical point of view, and a technical point of view has a peculiarly convincing character, at least to a certain type of person, so I leave it at that. And again, you should know that Strauss has treated this question of history in several of his other writings. The crisis of modernity on which we have been reflecting leads to the suggestion that we should return. But return to what? Obviously, to Western civilization in its pre-modern integrity, to the principles of Western civilization. And aren't you familiar with this kind of, there's a crisis. Things have gone off the rails. The whole world is going mad. We're pushing all kinds of crazy things on the children and on the adults, and all the institutions are collapsing, and this and that and the other thing. What do we need to do? Return to the principles and to the pillars of Western civilization. I know you're familiar with this kind of argument and position. But there's a problem. What is it? There's a difficulty here, Strauss writes, because Western civilization consists of two elements, has two roots, which are in radical disagreement with each other. We may call these elements, as I have done elsewhere, Jerusalem and Athens, or to speak in non-metaphorical language, the Bible and Greek philosophy. This radical disagreement today is frequently played down, and this playing down has a certain superficial justification. For the whole history of the West presents itself, at first glance, as an attempt to harmonize or to synthesize the Bible and Greek philosophy. But a closer study shows that what has happened and has been happening in the West for many centuries is not a harmonization, but an attempt at harmonization. These attempts at harmonization were doomed to failure for the following reason. Each of these two roots of the Western world sets forth one thing as the one thing needful. And the one thing needful proclaimed by the Bible is incompatible, as it is understood by the Bible, with the one thing needful proclaimed by Greek philosophy, as it is understood by Greek philosophy. To put it very simply, and therefore somewhat crudely, the one thing needful according to Greek philosophy is the life of autonomous understanding. The one thing needful as spoken by the Bible is the life of obedient love. The harmonizations and synthesizations are possible because Greek philosophy can use obedient love and a subservient function. And the Bible can use philosophy as a handmaid. But what is so used in each case rebels against such use, and therefore the conflict is really a radical one. Yet, this very disagreement presupposes some agreement. In fact, every disagreement, we may say, presupposes some agreement because people must disagree about something and must agree as to the importance of that something. But in this case, the agreement is deeper than this purely formal one. Now, what then is the area of agreement between Greek philosophy and the Bible? Negatively, we could say, and one could easily enlarge on this position, that there's a perfect agreement between the Bible and Greek philosophy in opposition to those elements of modernity which we described above. They are rejected, explicitly or implicitly, by both the Bible and Greek philosophy. But this agreement is, of course, only an implicit one, and we should rather look at the agreement as it appeared directly in the text. One can say, and it is not misleading to say so, that the Bible and Greek philosophy agree in regard to what we may call, and we do in fact call, morality. If I may say so, they agree regarding the importance of morality, regarding the content of morality, and regarding its ultimate insufficiency. They differ as regard that X, which supplements or completes morality, or which is only another way of putting it, they disagree as regards the basis of morality. So Strauss is not going to tell us. Crisis of modernity. What's the alternative? Pillars of the West. What's the problem? There are two pillars. There are two roots, and they disagree as to the fundamental issue. What are the two roots? Bible on one hand, Greek philosophy on the other. Is there something that they agree on? Yes, they agree on morality and the limits of morality. And now Strauss has to explain. So we can see what sense do we make of their agreement and what sense do we make of their disagreement. I will give you first a brief statement, he says, a reminder rather of the agreement. Now, some people assert that there's a radical and unqualified opposition between biblical morality and philosophic morality. If one heard certain people speak, one would believe that the Greek philosophers did nothing but preach pederasty, whereas Moses did nothing but curb pederasty. Now, these people must have limited themselves to a most perfunctory reading of a part of Plato's banquet, that means the symposium, or of the beginning of the Charmides, but they cannot have read the only work in which Plato set forth specific prescriptions for human society, namely Plato's Laws. And what Plato's Laws says about this subject of pederasty, agrees fully with what Moses says. Okay, so Strauss is very much pointing out here the superficiality of the readers who think they know something about Greek morality. Not only have they not read the symposium, they haven't read the laws, therefore they don't see the similarity of the Mosaic to the Platonic laws. Those theologians who identified the second table of the Decalogue, as the Christians call it, with the natural law of Greek philosophy were well advised. Okay, the Decalogue, you know, the 10 Commandments. It is as obvious to Aristotle as it is to Moses that murder, theft, adultery, etc. are unqualifiedly bad. Greek philosophy and the Bible agree as to this, that the proper framework of morality is the patriarchal family, which is or tends to be monogamous, and which forms the cell of a society in which the free adult males, and especially the old ones, predominate. Whatever the Bible and philosophy may tell us about the nobility of certain women, in principle both insist upon the superiority of the male sex. The Bible traces Adam's fall to Eve's temptation. Plato traces the fall of the best social order to the covetousness of a woman. Consisting of free men, the society praised by the Bible and Greek philosophy refuses to worship any human being. I do not have to quote the Bible, for I read it in a Greek author who says, "You worship no human being as your Lord, but only the gods." And he expresses an almost biblical abhorrence of human beings who claim divine honors. Bible and Greek philosophy agree in assigning the highest place among the virtues not to courage or manliness, but rather to justice. And by justice, both understand primarily obedience to the law. The law that requires man's full obedience is in both cases not merely civil, penal, constitutional law, but moral and religious law as well. It is, in biblical language, the guidance, the Torah, for the whole life of man. In the words of the Bible, it is your life, or it is the tree of life for those who cling to it. And in the words of Plato, the law affects the blessedness of those who obey it. Its comprehensiveness can be expressed as Aristotle does it by saying, what the law does not command, it forbids. And substantially, that is the biblical view as well, as was shown by such commandments as, thou shalt eat and be full and be fruitful and multiply. Obedience to a law of this kind is more than ordinary obedience, it is humility. No wonder that the greatest prophet of the Bible, as well as the most law-abiding among the Greeks, are praised for their humility. Law and justice, thus understood, are divine law and divine justice. The rule of law is fundamentally the rule of God, theocracy. Man's obedience and disobedience to the law is the object of divine retribution. What Plato says in the 10th book of the Laws about man's inability to escape from divine retribution is almost literally identical with certain verses of Amos and the 139th Psalm. In this context, one may even mention, without apology, I think, the kinship between the monotheism of the Bible and the monotheism towards which Greek philosophy is tending, and the kinship between the first chapter of Genesis and Plato's Timaeus. But the Bible and Greek philosophy agree not merely regarding the place which they assign to justice, the connection between justice and law, the character of law and divine retribution, they also agree regarding the problem of justice, the difficulty created by the misery of the just and the prospering of the wicked. One cannot read Plato's description in the second book of the Republic of the perfectly just man who suffers what would be the just fate of the most unjust man, without being reminded of Isaiah's description of him who has done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth, yet who was oppressed and afflicted and brought as a lamb to the slaughter. And just as Plato's Republic ends with restoring all kinds of prosperity to the just, the book of Job ends with the restoration to the just Job of everything he had temporarily lost. Okay, so Strauss said, let me show you the agreement between the Bible and Greek science or Greek philosophy. And he's just gone through it. The theocracy, as it were, the divine concern for human affairs, the importance of justice and the law, and these other things that he's mentioned here. Not to state, again, the similarities between Timaeus and Genesis, between Job and the second book of the Republic, which, by the way, there's a course on the Republic at millermanschool.com. Now, in the course of these extremely summary remarks, Strauss continues, I have tacitly replaced morality by justice, understanding by justice obedience to the divine law. This notion, the divine law, it seems to me, is the common ground between the Bible and Greek philosophy. And here I use a term which is certainly easily translatable into Greek as well as into Biblical Hebrew. But I must be more precise. The common ground between the Bible and Greek philosophy is the problem of divine law. They solve that problem in a diametrically opposed manner. Before I speak of the root of their difference, Strauss continues, I would like to illustrate the fundamental antagonism between the Bible and philosophy by enumerating some of its consequences. I have indicated the place of justice in both Bible and Greek philosophy. We may take Aristotle's Ethics as the most perfect, or certainly the most accessible presentation of philosophic ethics. Now, Aristotle's Ethics has two foci, not one. One is justice. The other, however, is magnanimity, or noble pride. Both justice and magnanimity comprise all other virtues, as Aristotle says, but in different ways. Justice comprises all other virtues insofar as the actions flowing from them relate to other men, to other people, okay? Magnanimity, however, comprises all other virtues insofar as they enhance the man himself. Now, there's a close kinship between Aristotle's justice and biblical justice, but Aristotle's magnanimity, which means a man's habitual claiming for himself great honors while he deserves these honors, is alien to the Bible. Biblical humility excludes magnanimity in the Greek sense. There's a close relation between the magnanimous man and the perfect gentleman. There occur a few, very few, gentlemen and ladies in the Bible. I hope that this remark is not understood as a criticism of the Bible. There is Saul, who disobeys a divine command and by doing so does the noble thing. He spared his brother King Agag and destroys only what is vile and refuse. For this he was rejected by God, and Agag was hewn to pieces by the prophet Samuel before the Lord. In other words, that's Strauss giving an example of the punishment, as it were, of a magnanimous act in the Bible. Instead of Saul, God elected David, who did a lot of things a gentleman would not do, who was one of the greatest sinners, but at the same time, one of the greatest repenters who ever lived. There's a gentleman, Jonathan, who is too noble to compete with his friend David for kingship in Israel. There's a lady, Michal, the wife of David, who saw David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart and ridiculed him for having shamelessly compromised his royal dignity by leaping and dancing before the riffraff. but she was punished by God with sterility. I need not dwell on the obvious connection between the biblical rejection of the concept of gentleman and the biblical insistence on man's duties to the poor. The Greek philosophers were very far from being vulgar worshippers of wealth, must I say so? Socrates lived in thousandfold poverty, as he himself says, and he cannot fail to see why a horse can be good without having money, whereas man cannot. But they, the Greeks, held that as far as the general run of man is concerned, virtue presupposes a reasonable economic underpinning. The Bible, on the other hand, uses poor and pious or just as synonymous terms. Compared with the Bible, Greek philosophy is heartless in this as well as in other respects. Magnanimity presupposes a man's conviction of his own worth. It presupposes that man is capable of being virtuous thanks to his own efforts. If this condition is fulfilled, consciousness of one's shortcomings or failings or sins is something which is below the good man. Again, I quote Aristotle, Strauss says, "The sense of shame, which is such consciousness of human failing, befits young men who cannot yet be fully virtuous, but not men of mature age, who are free not to do the wrong thing in the first place." Or to quote the remark made by one 20th century gentleman about another, disgrace was impossible because of his character and behavior. The Greek philosophers differed as to whether man can become fully virtuous, but if some deny this possibility, as Socrates does, he merely replaces his self-satisfaction, the self-admiration of the virtuous man, by the self-satisfaction or self-admiration of him who steadily progresses in virtue. He doesn't imply, as far as the happy few are concerned, that they should be contrite, repentant, or express a sense of guilt. Let me just interject here super quickly, in case you're losing track. Strauss had told us the similarities between the Bible and Greek philosophy, namely their similar orientation towards the divine law, or rather the problem of divine law. But there's a huge difference because the Greek morality includes this sense of the magnanimous man whose greatness doesn't depend on his relationship to other people, and certainly who isn't sinful and shameful and repentant, but who's just great and he knows it. A very unbiblical notion, Strauss is saying. Distinctly Greek and distinctly unbiblical. Man's guilt was indeed the guiding theme to tragedy. Hence, Plato rejects tragedy from his best city. I do not say that is the whole story. That is only part of the story, as you see from the fact that tragedy is replaced by songs praising the virtuous. And according to Aristotle, the tragic hero is necessarily an average man, not a man of the highest order. However, it should be noted that tragedy is composed and performed for the benefit of the multitude. Its function is to arouse the passions of fear and pity, while at the same time purging them. Now, fear and pity are precisely the passions which are necessarily connected with the feeling of guilt. When I become guilty, when I become aware of my being guilty, I have at once the feeling of pity toward him whom I have hurt or ruined, and the feeling of fear of him who avenges my crime. Humanly speaking, the unity of fear and pity combined with the phenomenon of guilt might seem to be the root of religion. God, the king or the judge, is the object of fear. And God, the Father of all men, makes all men brothers and thus hallows pity. According to Aristotle, without these feelings which have to be purged by tragedy, the better type of man is liberated from all morbidity and thus can turn wholeheartedly to noble action. He doesn't have to self-flagellate, as it were. Greek philosophy has frequently been blamed for the absence from it of that ruthless examination of one's intentions, which is the consequence of the biblical demand for purity of heart. Know thyself means for the Greeks, know what it means to be a human being. Know what is the place of man in the universe. Examine your opinions and prejudices, rather than search your heart. This philosophic lack of depth, as it is called, can consistently be maintained only if God is assumed not to be concerned with man's goodness, or if man's goodness is assumed to be entirely his own affair. The Bible and Greek philosophy agree indeed as regards the importance of morality or justice, and as to the insufficiency of morality, but they disagree as to what completes morality. According to the Greek philosophers, as already noted, it is understanding or contemplation. Now, this necessarily tends to weaken the majesty of the moral demands, whereas humility, a sense of guilt, repentance, and faith in divine mercy, which complete morality according to the Bible, necessarily strengthen the majesty of the moral demands. A sign of this is the fact that contemplation is essentially a trans or asocial possibility. You can do it alone, I add here parenthetically. Whereas obedience and faith are essentially related to the community of the faithful. To quote the Jewish medieval thinker Yehuda Halevi, the wisdom of the Greeks has most beautiful blossoms, but no fruits, with fruits here meaning actions. That asocial perfection, which is contemplation, normally presupposes a political community, the city, which accordingly is considered by the philosophers as fundamentally good, and the same is true of the arts, without whose services and even model, political life and philosophical life are not possible. So philosophy presupposes the city. According to the Bible, however, the first founder of a city was the first murderer, and his descendants were the first inventors of the arts. Not the city, not civilization, but the desert is the place in which the biblical God reveals himself. Not the farmer Cain, but the shepherd Abel finds favor in the eyes of the biblical God. The force of the moral demand is weakened in Greek philosophy because in Greek philosophy, this demand is not backed up by divine promises. According to Plato, for example, evil will never cease on earth, whereas according to the Bible, the end of days will bring perfect redemption. Hence, the philosopher lives in a state above fear and trembling as well as above hope, and the beginning of his wisdom is not, as in the Bible, the fear of God, but rather the sense of wonder, whereas biblical man lives in fear and trembling as well as in hope. This leads to a particular serenity in the philosopher, which I would like to illustrate here by only one example, which I think is not wholly accidental. The prophet Nathan seriously and ruthlessly rebukes King David for having committed one murder and one act of adultery. I contrast that with the way in which a Greek poet-philosopher playfully and elegantly tries to convince a Greek tyrant who has committed an untold number of murders and other crimes that he would derive greater pleasure if he would be more reasonable. I think Strauss is referring there to Hiero by Xenophon, on which Strauss has written a book called On Tyranny, which is also a book I teach at my school, millermanschool.com. Okay, so two totally different approaches. One which rebukes a single murder, and another one which has to be silent about untold number of murders and other crimes, as an example of the different orientation towards morality. Now, let me leave it with these examples, which naturally are to a certain extent arbitrary, but I think not misleading, Strauss writes. I think I can illustrate the difference also as follows by two characteristic events or accounts. Contrast the account of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, in the story of Abraham. You know, Abraham is commanded to sacrifice Isaac. There, the crucial point is that Abraham obeys an unintelligible command, the command being unintelligible because he has been promised that his name would be called through Isaac and in the descendants of Isaac, and now he's asked to slaughter that son. So Abraham is asked to do something that is unintelligible. Yet, Abraham obeys the command unhesitatingly. Okay, you see that? Abraham is asked to do something unintelligible, and he obeys. The only analogy in Greek philosophy of which I can think would be the example of Socrates, who is, or believes at least, that he has been commanded by Apollo to do something. You could read the Apology, by the way, for the story here. And yet the action consists not in unhesitating obedience, but in examining an unintelligible saying of Apollo. Okay, so in the biblical example, Abraham follows an unintelligible command. And in the Greek example, Socrates does not follow an unintelligible view. Rather, he examines it, tries to make sense of it in a Socratic and philosophical way. Now, after these illustrations, what is the difference? These principles were clarified, particularly in the medieval discussion, in the heyday of theological discussion. Maimonides, especially in the Guide for the Perplexed, which you can see the second volume right above my finger on screen, right there. In the Guide for the Perplexed is probably the greatest analyst of this fundamental difference. The issue, as he stated it, was as follows. Philosophy teaches the eternity of the world, and the Bible teaches the creation out of nothing. This conflict must be rightly understood because Maimonides is primarily thinking of Aristotle, who taught the eternity of the visible universe. But if you enlarge that and apply it not only to this cosmos, to this visible universe in which we now live, but to any cosmos or chaos which might ever exist, certainly Greek philosophy teaches the eternity of cosmos or chaos, whereas the Bible teaches creation, implying creation out of nothing. The root of the matter, however, is that only the Bible teaches divine omnipotence, and the thought of divine omnipotence is absolutely incompatible with Greek philosophy in any form. And I think one can even trace that back to the very beginnings of Greek literature, though technically much beyond philosophy, to the passage in the Odyssey, where Hermes shows Odysseus a certain herb, which he could use for protecting himself and his fellows against Circe. Now, in this context, the gods can do everything. The gods are omnipotent, one can say, but it is very interesting what this concept means in this context. Why are the gods omnipotent? Because they know the natures of all things, which means, of course, they are not omnipotent. They know the natures of things which are wholly independent of them, and through that knowledge, they're capable of using all things properly. In all Greek thought, we find in one form or another an impersonal necessity, higher than any personal being. Whereas in the Bible, the first cause is, as people say now, a person. This is connected with the fact that the concern of God with man is absolutely, if we may say so, essential to the biblical God, whereas that concern is, to put it very mildly, a problem for every Greek philosopher. Stated somewhat differently, what is now called religious experience is underlined in the Bible and is understood by the Bible as genuine experience. Whereas from the point of view of the Greek philosophers, this religious experience is a questionable interpretation. I take the example of Plato, a questionable interpretation of experiences of the soul as an all-pervasive principle. We must try, as far as it is possible, to understand this antagonism. It can well be questioned whether what I am going to say, Strauss continues, can in truth be called an attempt at understanding, and so you can take it as a kind of illustration from the point of view of, say, social science. In order to clarify this antagonism between the Bible and Greek philosophy, it is proposed that we go back to the common stratum between Bible and Greek philosophy, to the most elementary stratum, a stratum which is common or can be assumed to be common to all men. How can we find that? I think it is easier to start from philosophy for the simple reason that the question which I raise here is a scientific or philosophic question. We have to move in the element of conceptual thought, as it is called, and that is, of course, the element of Greek philosophy. With a view to this fact, I, Strauss says, would like to state the issue more precisely. What distinguishes the Bible from Greek philosophy is the fact that Greek philosophy is based on this premise, that there is such a thing as nature, or natures, a notion which has no equivalent in biblical thought. It should be noted that there's no Hebrew biblical term for nature, the Hebrew word being derived very indirectly from a Greek word, which is an equivalent of nature in Greek, character, teva in Hebrew. So the issue from this point of view would be this. We have to go back behind that discovery or invention of nature. We have to try to discern what we may call the pre-philosophic equivalent of nature, and by starting from that, perhaps we can arrive at a purely historical understanding of the antagonism we are analyzing. Let me add parenthetically another point. Philosophy is the quest for principles, meaning, and let us be quite literal, for the beginnings, for the first things. This is, of course, something common to philosophy and myth, and I would suggest for the time being that philosophy, as distinguished from myth, comes into being when the quest for the beginnings is understood in the light of the idea of nature. Again, nature in the sense of things having a nature, not nature in the sense of trees and rivers. Now, what is the pre-philosophic equivalent of nature? I think we can find the answer to this question in such notions as custom or ways. This answer occurred to me very simply as a result of reading Maimonides, who knew the true roots of which I speak very well indeed. In the beginning of his great legal work, the Mishnah Torah, in the first section, Laws Regarding the Foundations of the Torah, chapter 4, he speaks of the four elements. Before he introduces the term nature, he speaks of the custom or way, the custom of fire and the way of earth, and somewhat later refers to the nature of water. And this insight goes, I think, to the root of the problem. The rubrics custom or way are biblical notions and are, of course, also to be found in Greek sources. Moreover, I would assume until the contrary has been proven that these ideas are really universal ones. People in all times and places have observed that things behave in a regular manner, that they have customs of behaving and ways of behaving. Take, for example, a biblical expression, the way of women, menstruation, or in Greek an expression such as the custom of beasts, meaning the same as the nature of beasts, or again in biblical Hebrew, the word mishpat means the custom or law of a thing as reflected in its regular behavior. In this context, it is clear that no distinction is made between the custom of dogs and the custom of Philistines, for example. A Philistine regularly behaves in his way, the dog regularly behaves in his way. You can also take lions in Hebrews. If you think I employ only poor examples, Strauss says here, jokingly, as it were. So things have a regular behavior, customs or ways. I've also learned from a Hindu student that the Hindu term dharma, which is usually translated as religion, means custom or way, and can refer to such things as the custom or way of iron, of trees, and of whatnot. And since the custom or way of human beings is, of course, the Hindu religion, it means derivatively, if most importantly, what is according to religion. Okay, so what is Strauss saying? We're getting behind the distinction between biblical morality, or between the Bible and Greek science, by trying to find the root of the distinction in the two, trying to find the pre-philosophic notion of nature. And Strauss here, as he does in Natural Right and History, finds it in the notion of a way or a custom. If we now assume that this idea of the way is really the pre-philosophic equivalent of nature, we have immediately to add to this very obvious observation that there's one way among the many ways which is particularly important, and that is the way of the group to which one belongs, our way. Now, our way is, of course, the right way. And why is it right? The answer, because it is old and because it is one's own. Or to use the beautiful expression of Edmund Burke, because it is homebred and prescriptive. We can bring it all together under the term ancestral. Hence, the original notion is that the ancestral is identical with the good. The good is necessarily ancestral, which implies, since man was always a thinking being, that the ancestors were superior. Right? If the good is the ancestral, then the further back you go, the better it gets. That means the ancestors were superior. If this were not the case, in what sense would the ancestral be good? The ancestors are superior, and therefore the ancestors must be understood, if this notion is fully thought through, as gods, or sons of gods, or pupils of gods. In other words, it is necessary to consider the right way as the divine law, theos nomos. Whether this conclusion is always reached is, of course, uninteresting to us, because we admit the possibility that sometimes people do not think with sufficient penetration, but in those places where they did, they arrived at this understanding. Okay, did you get the argument? The pre-philosophic notion of nature is way. Way always means our way, our custom. It's premised on the idea that the ancestral is the good, and therefore that the ancestors are gods or sons of gods, or in some sense divine. Unfortunately, though, the divine law, the theos nomos, to use the Greek image, leads us to two fundamental alternatives. One is the character of Greek philosophy, the other is the character of the Bible. Now, why is this problematic? The answer is all too familiar, i.e., the variety of divine laws. We find everywhere such orders claiming to be divine, and these orders are not only different from one another. That would not technically be a difficulty because different gods could have assigned different codes to different tribes, but they contradict each other. So this is the problem. In every code of this kind, there are some elements which claim to be universal. For example, one has only to read Herodotus to get very beautiful examples of conflicting claims. One tribe burned the dead, and the other buried them. Now, the alternative burial custom was not only looked upon as a different a different cultural pattern, but as an abomination. So we may say that different laws contradict each other, and they contradict each other especially regarding what they say about the first things, because no early code, written or unwritten, is unthinkable without a preamble which explains the obligations involved and which provides an account of the first things. Now Strauss draws the conclusion for us. Given this variety and this contradictory character of the various allegedly divine codes, it becomes necessary to transcend this whole dimension, to find one's bearings independently of the ancestral, or to realize, I add here crucially, that the ancestral and the good are two fundamentally different things, despite occasional coincidences between them. There is, too, the basic question of how to find one's bearings in the cosmos. The Greek answer fundamentally is this: we have to discover the first things on the basis of inquiry. That everyone knows. We can note two implications of what inquiry means here. In the first place, seeing with one's own eyes as distinguished from hearsay, to observe for oneself. And secondly, the notion of inquiry presupposes the realization of the fundamental difference between human production and the production of things which are not man-made, so that no conclusion from human production to the production of non-man-made things is possible, except if it is first established by demonstration that the visible universe has been made by thinking beings. Say that quickly. So Strauss says, on one hand, you have to prove things not by hearsay. How do we know that our ancestors were gods or students of gods, or how do we know that the code is divine? Because there's a tradition. Well, did you see it for yourself? Did you see it on the basis of firsthand experience? Philosophical science demands that you did. The older traditional ancestral view doesn't demand it. And secondly, he wants us to pay attention to the distinction between what's made by us and what's not made by us. And in light of those distinctions, we get some crucial insight, as you'll see here in a minute. The implication, I think, is decisive. It was on the basis of the principles of Greek philosophy that what later became known as demonstrations of the existence of God or gods came into being. That is absolutely necessary and true not only in Aristotle, but in Plato as well, as you see, for example, from the 10th book of the Laws. In other words, according to the Greek thought, you have to demonstrate the existence of the gods. An assent from sense perception and reasoning on sense data, an assent indeed guided, according to Plato and Aristotle, by certain notions, leads upwards, and everything depends on the solidity of the ascending process on the demonstration. Because the quest for the beginning, for the first things, becomes now philosophic or scientific analysis of the cosmos, the place of the divine law in the traditional sense of the term, where it is a code traced to a personal God, is replaced by a natural order, which may even be called, as it was later to be called, a natural law, or at any rate, to use a wider term, a natural morality. So the divine law, in the real and strict sense of the term, is only the starting point, the absolutely essential starting point for Greek philosophy, but it is abandoned in the process. And if it is accepted by Greek philosophy, it is accepted only politically, meaning for the education of the many, and not as something which stands independently. To understand the biblical notion in the sense of understanding to which I refer, one can say this: the Bible, biblical thought, clings to this notion that there is one particular divine law, but it contends that this particular divine law is the only one which is truly divine law. All these other codes are, in their claim to divine origin, fraudulent. They are figments of man. Since, however, one code is accepted, then no possibility of independent questioning arises and is meant to arise. Now, what then is it that distinguishes the biblical solution from the mythical solution? I think it is this, Strauss continues, that the author or authors of the Bible were aware of the problem of the variety of divine law. In other words, they realized, and I'm now speaking not as a theologian but as an historian, they realized what are the absolutely necessary conditions if one particular law should be the divine law. How has one to conceive of the whole if one particular and therefore contingent law, one particular and therefore contingent law of one particular contingent tribe is to be the divine law? The answer is it must be a personal God. The first cause must be God. He must be omnipotent, not controlled and not controllable. But to be knowable means to be controllable, and therefore he must not be knowable in the strict sense of the term. Thus, in the language of later thought, of already Grecified thought, God's essence is not knowable. As the Bible says, one cannot see God's face. But this is not radical enough, and the divine name given in Exodus, which literally translated means I shall be what I shall be, is the most radical formulation of that. So if you know Moses in the burning bush asks God for his name, God says, I shall be what I shall be, and that's taken to be the renunciation of the idea that God has a noble essence. It's just the opposite of the Greek notion of essence, where it means the being is what it is, and was, and will be. But here the core, one could say, is inaccessible. It is absolutely free. God is what he shall be. It is a free God, unpredictable. Why then can man trust him? Answer, only because of the covenant. God has freely bound himself, but all trust depends on trust in God's word, in God's promise. There is no necessary and therefore intelligible relation. And needless to say, this covenant is not a free covenant, freely entered into by originally independent partners. It is a covenant which, according to the Bible, God commanded man to perform. To complete this extremely sketchy picture by a few points, I would like to say this. Strauss continues, there's no doubt that the Greek philosophers of the classical period did not know the Bible, and it is, I think, generally admitted that the authors of the Bible did not know the Greek philosophers. But the extraordinary fact is that if one studies both the Greek philosophers and the Bible a little more carefully, one sees that in both sources of Western thought, the alternative was, if I may say so, divine. Even in Aristotle, you will find passages where he speaks of certain very crude notions in Greece, which pointed fundamentally to what we know in the Bible in a more developed form. For example, the notion that maybe it is bad to devote oneself to the philosophical rebellion against God. By way of comparison, now consider the perfect agreement as to the decisive biblical message between the first account of creation and the second account of creation, the second account of creation which culminates in the story of the fall. It is the same notion which underlies the account of the first chapter of the depreciation of heaven and the prohibition against eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because the knowledge of good and evil means, of course, not one special branch of knowledge, as is shown by the fact that in God's knowing of the created things, they always end and he saw it was good. The completed thing, the complete knowledge of the completed thing is knowledge of the good, the notion being that the desire for or striving for knowledge is forbidden. Man is not meant to be a theoretical, a knowing, a contemplating being. Man is meant to live in childlike obedience. Needless to say, this notion was modified in various ways in the later tradition, but it seems to me that the fundamental thought was preserved if we disregard some marginal developments. Okay, huge difference Strauss is putting his finger on between the Bible and philosophy. What then is the principle underlying the seemingly changed attitude of later times? I think we can understand this from the Bible itself. You recall that the story of the fall is followed by the account of Cain and later on by the genealogy of Cain, where the city and the arts are assigned to this undesirable branch of mankind. And yet later on, we find that there is a very different attitude towards the city and arts. Think of the holy city of Jerusalem and of the arts which Bezalel used in adorning the temple, etc. I think we find the clearest discussion of this issue later on in the discussion of kingship, of the institution of human kingship in Israel in the first book of Samuel, where we see that the general trend of the biblical solution is, what the general trend of the biblical solution is. You should read, by the way, if you're interested in this politics of the book of Samuel, there's a good book on that by Moshe Halbertal and Stephen Holmes. It's called The Beginning of Politics, I think, on the book of Samuel. Fundamentally, the institution of human kingship is bad. It is a kind of rebellion against God, as is the polis and the arts and knowledge. But then it becomes possible by divine dispensation that these things which originate in human rebellion become dedicated to the service of God and thus become holy. And I think that this is the biblical solution to the problem of human knowledge. Human knowledge, if it is dedicated to the service of God, and only then can be good. And perhaps in that sense it is even necessary. But without that dedication, it is a rebellion. Man was given understanding in order to understand God's commands. He could not be freely obedient if he did not have understanding. But at the same time, this very fact allows man to emancipate the understanding from the service, from the subservient function for which it was meant. And this emancipation is the origin of philosophy or science from the biblical point of view. And so the antagonism between them. Even if you take later versions as your model, for example, so-called Jewish medieval philosophy, you will still find that this difficulty is very noticeable. However this may be, it seems to me, Strauss continues, that this antagonism must be considered by us in action. That is to say, it seems to me that the core, the nerve of Western intellectual history, Western spiritual history, one could almost say, is the conflict between the biblical and the philosophic notions of the good life. This was a conflict which showed itself primarily, of course, in arguments advanced by theologians on behalf of the biblical point of view, and by philosophers on behalf of the philosophic point of view. There are many reasons why this is important, but I, Strauss continues, would like to emphasize only one. It seems to me that this unresolved conflict is the secret of the vitality of Western civilization. The recognition of two conflicting roots of Western civilization is at first a very disconcerting observation. Yet this realization has also something reassuring and comforting about it. The very life of Western civilization is the life between two codes of fundamental tension. There is therefore no reason inherent in the Western civilization itself and its fundamental constitution why it should give up life. But this comforting thought is justified only if we live that life, if we live that conflict. No one can be both a philosopher and a theologian, nor, for that matter, some possibility which transcends the conflict between philosophy and theology, or pretends to be a synthesis of both. But, to read now the final sentence of Strauss on Progress or Return, the Contemporary Crisis, every one of us can be and ought to be either one or the other, the philosopher open to the challenge of theology, or the theologian open to the challenge of philosophy. So, thank you for those of you who are here, who watch this either now or later. We just have spent the last 2 hours reading and commenting on Leo Strauss's Progress or Return, the Contemporary Crisis in Western Civilization. And just a quick note here, which I skipped when I was reading it, but you might want to know now in hindsight, reading this footnote. This lecture is published thanks to the assistance la-di-da-di-da. It represents an edited version of 2 of 3 public lectures Professor Strauss delivered at the Hillel House, University of Chicago in 1952. So if you're wondering when about Strauss was addressing the question of progress or return, the crisis of Western civilization, Nietzsche on relativity of science, and all these other great themes that Strauss addressed here with such profundity and so memorable formulations, 1952. Okay, so I hope that you found something in that. I know it's a longer stream than our usual ones, but sometimes that's what it takes. So I would like to ask you, like, subscribe, share, go to millermanschool.com. Let me know other things you'd like me to read on the channel. I enjoy spending my time together with you in this way and just reading and commenting as we go through. So it's a rich essay. You know, you didn't just hear me read it and then believe that you've mastered it. Strauss gave us many distinctions here. In the first half, maybe seemingly narrow there on Spinoza and Teshuvah and Gershom Scholem and all of these kind of narrowly religious topics in a Jewish light, you may have thought. But by the end, you see we have the problem of progress the problem of modernity, biblical morality without the biblical God, crisis of modern science and rationalism, return to the roots of the Western tradition, but they disagree about the most fundamental question. And yet their very disagreement puts us into a life of thoughtful consideration, either, as he put it at the end. Let's just reread that. So leave you with the call to action, so to speak. Strauss's call to action, not mine, which I've already said. Right? To be a philosopher open to the challenge of theology, or a theologian open to the challenge of philosophy, and in doing so, to help reignite the vital spirit of Western civilization. Only in this way, for Strauss. Only as a philosopher open to the challenge of theology, or as a theologian open to the challenge of philosophy. If you care about Western civilization, if you care about the crisis of the West, if you care about the future of the West, and you want to play your part, this is what Strauss suggests. Put yourself into the world of Greek philosophy, open to the challenge of revelation, theology, or go all in on theology and revelation, but remain open to the challenge of philosophy. So, yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. Like, subscribe, share, millermanschool.com, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Be well. Goodbye.